Before the world ever knew his name, destiny tested him through the weight of bricks heavier than his childhood. In the dust of forgotten places, some lives begin quietly, yet carry storms powerful enough to reshape nations. And on that scorching morning, as his thin hands tightened around rough clay edges, the universe whispered a future he was still too young to imagine. Keen's day always began before the sun properly rose, when the morning breeze still carried the scent of night, and the ground beneath his bare feet felt cool enough to comfort a body destined for exhaustion. He walked across the construction yard with the slow, practiced steps of someone who had carried weight long before his shoulders were ready for it. The horizon glowed faintly, casting long shadows against stacks of bricks that towered like silent guardians over the field of labor. Men with hardened hands and tired eyes gathered around wheelbarrows and cement bags, exchanging nods that held more fatigue than words. They barely glanced at the boy weaving between them, balancing bricks twice the size of his palms with a steadiness that should have belonged to someone much older. To them, Keen was just another pair of hands, small, quiet, and forgettable. But the boy himself saw the world differently. While others cursed the rising heat, he studied the way sunlight touched the unfinished walls, examining how each brick fit into the next with a sense of curiosity that did not belong in a place built on survival. Every angle fascinated him. Every uneven edge drew his focus like a puzzle he longed to solve. He found himself tracing the lines where one layer ended and another began, imagining the skeleton of the structure beneath the weight of cement. And though he had never read a book on design or heard the word architecture spoken with meaning, something in his soul recognized the language of building as if it were carved into his blood. By midday, the yard turned harsh under the sun's glare, and the gravel heated enough to scorch even the calloused soles of his feet. Sweat carved thin rivers down his temples, soaking into the collar of his torn shirt. Yet his gaze remained sharp, absorbing every detail with a hunger no meal could satisfy. He watched the foreman measure a beam with a metal tape, noting how he squinted at each mark as though precision itself demanded reverence. Keen memorized the alignment, storing the pattern in the quiet recesses of his mind, the way others stored stories or songs. Though he barely spoke during work hours, his silence was never empty. It throbbed with observation, with a private awareness that the world he lived in was built from deliberate choices he longed to understand. When the day finally slowed and the workers gathered to rest, Kane slipped away to sit beside the old water drum at the yard's edge. The metal felt warm beneath his back, and the evening breeze brushed cool fingers across his dusty skin. Here, in the eye of moments between fatigue and sleep, he replayed the entire day the way others rewound memories of joy. He visualized the cracks in the walls, the alignment of the beams, the shape of the windows being framed by men who never knew he watched. His mind rearranged the entire building as if shifting pieces within an unseen blueprint. Sometimes, he wondered why these images came so easily to him, why bricks spoke louder to him than people ever did. Yet he never voiced these thoughts. Dreams were fragile things in a world where survival demanded practicality. He had seen how quickly hope could crumble when weighed against hunger, debt, or loss. So he held his quiet fascination close, nurturing it like a hidden fire he kept alive beneath layers of dust and duty. But deep within, he sensed something growing, an instinct, a calling, a strange certainty that his life would not be confined to carrying burdens built by others. Even if he could not name it yet, he felt it rising, shaping him slowly with each brick he lifted. Still, he did not know his world was about to shift, because destiny rarely announces itself politely. It chooses sudden moments, sharp as lightning, brief as breath. And for Keen, that moment arrived not through kindness or opportunity, but through anger sharp enough to cut the air. One afternoon, as he passed the eastern wall with a stack of bricks pressed against his shoulder, an engineer's furious complaint ripped through the yard. The words struck Keen like a secret, meant only for him. revealing a truth so powerful it made his pulse stumble. And in that instant, without realizing it, the boy carrying bricks stepped toward the future that had been waiting for him all along. Sometimes destiny doesn't arrive gently. It slips into a life through someone else's anger. And on that blistering afternoon, as a stranger's frustration echoed across the yard, a single complaint carved open a world Keen never knew existed. In the chaos of scolding voices and hurried footsteps, a spark caught fire inside him, quiet, but powerful enough to reshape his future. The day had begun like any other, shaped by heat, dust, and the relentless rhythm of lifting bricks until his arms numbed into obedience. But as the workers dragged themselves through the final stretch before midday rest, a visiting engineer arrived at the site. A tall, sharp-eyed man whose presence unsettled even the foreman. His steps were precise, each stride cutting through the yard with authority. He surveyed the half-built structure with a gaze that missed nothing, moving from one beam to the next with a frown etched so deeply it seemed carved into his bones. The workers straightened instinctively, sensing the tension rising like a storm that had no intention of passing quietly. Keen stood near the west wall, balancing bricks when the engineer's voice exploded through the air, loud, clipped, and shaking with irritation. He pointed at a beam overhead, its angle slightly off, its alignment betraying a flaw invisible to untrained eyes. The workers shrank beneath his rebuke as he scolded them for negligence, for failing to respect the mathematics of construction, for treating the skeleton of a building with careless hands. His words were sharp, but the knowledge buried beneath them carried a depth that struck Keen harder than any insult could. While others flinched at the tone, Keen leaned into the meaning, his mind catching every detail with hungry curiosity. The engineer demonstrated the correct angle, snapping his tape measure into place, repositioning his level, marking invisible lines in the air with gestures that spoke a language Keen felt he had heard before, somewhere deep within, long before understanding found him. He explained how a single misalignment could compromise entire floors, how shadows revealed flaws, how tension traveled through beams like water through roots. And though his words were meant to correct grown men, it was the barefoot boy, standing quietly in the dust, who absorbed every syllable as if he were memorizing sacred scripture. When the engineer finally walked away, the workers muttered among themselves, dismissing him with irritation. But Keeney remained still, replaying the corrections in his mind with astonishing clarity. His heartbeat pulsed with a strange excitement he did not yet know how to name. As the others dispersed for rest, he slipped to the edge of the yard, where the dirt lay undisturbed, cool beneath the shade of a leaning metal sheet. Kneeling down, he traced the misaligned beam exactly as he remembered it. Slow strokes first, then sharper ones as the memory sharpened. He redrew the correct alignment beside it, comparing the lines, adjusting the angles, refining the structure with a precision that made the world around him blur into silence. He did not rush. He did not guess. His fingers moved with the instinctive certainty of someone who had always belonged to this world, long before he understood it. Dust clung to his fingertips, coating his nails, settling into the lines of his palms, but he welcomed the sensation. It felt like touching truth. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the yard, but Kate barely noticed. He redrew the beam several times, testing angles, correcting mistakes, discovering possibilities. Each line awakened something deeper, a sense of purpose that felt both new and achingly familiar. He imagined walls rising from the ground because of choices he made, imagined families sleeping under roofs built from lines he once traced in dirt. The thought filled him with a quiet, trembling awe he couldn't contain. That night, long after the workers had settled, Keen returned to the same spot with a small piece of charcoal he stole from an abandoned fire pit. He bent once more over the earth, sketching not just beams now, but entire frames, triangles supporting weight, door frames positioned for balance, ceilings distributed evenly. The world seemed to unfold beneath his fingers, each stroke revealing a future he had never dared picture. His heart felt fuller than it ever had while carrying bricks. But destiny observes silently, choosing its moments with precision. And as the first hint of dawn painted the sky in muted lavender, Keen bent over his latest sketch, completely absorbed, unaware that footsteps had stopped behind him. Someone watched him with an expression neither hostile nor curious, but stunned, as though witnessing the birth of something extraordinary. A single breath escaped the watcher, soft yet sharp enough to break the dawn's stillness. Keen froze, charcoal suspended in mid-air, unaware that this silent witness was about to change the entire direction of his life. Sometimes it takes only one drawing to expose a truth the world refused to see. And on that quiet morning, as lines formed beneath Keen's trembling fingers, a simple sketch in the dust shattered every assumption about who he was supposed to be. In the space between shadows and rising sun, the boy who carried bricks revealed a brilliance he never knew he possessed. The morning arrived with a softness the construction yard rarely offered. The air, usually thick with dust and impatience, felt strangely calm, as though the world itself was pausing to watch something unfold. Workers murmured sleepily while gathering tools, unaware that a discovery waited only a few steps away. Keen, still barefoot and carrying the scent of early dawn on his clothes, hurried to the spot where he had drawn the night before. The earth held faint whispers of his previous sketches, smudged beams, faint outlines, fragments of angles he had tested and erased. Kneeling once more, he gripped the small piece of charcoal he had guarded through the night, feeling the quiet thrum of anticipation pulse beneath his skin. He began to draw, not with hesitation, but with the steady certainty of someone who had been doing this far longer than a single night. He outlined the foundation first, marking its perimeter with long, deliberate strokes. Then came the load-bearing walls, rising invisibly at first until the lines took shape beneath his hand. He added window placements that balanced light and airflow, pressure points where beams met reinforcement, and roof angles that returned rainwater toward safe pathways. The dust became his canvas, and the charcoal transformed into a tool that obeyed instinct more than knowledge. His mind replayed the engineer's corrections with perfect clarity, weaving them effortlessly into this new creation, guided by a logic he felt rather than learned. He was so absorbed in the growing structure beneath him that he didn't hear the approaching footsteps. The foreman, known for his authoritative voice and stern discipline, had come early to check supplies. His eyes swept the yard automatically, scanning for idle workers. But when his gaze landed on the small figure crouched in the dirt, his steps slowed, until he stopped completely. For a moment, he thought the boy was simply wasting time or playing with shapes, but then he watched more closely. His brow furrowed as he noticed the precision in the lines, the symmetry, the alignment, the measured spacing. He stepped closer, and what he saw made silence wrap itself around him. This was no random drawing. This was a building plan. The foreman lowered himself slowly to his knees, careful not to disturb the edges of the sketch. He traced the air above one of the lines, his fingers trembling as he recognized details that mirrored professional work. Details even some trained assistants failed to grasp. Keen finally sensed the presence beside him and snapped into stillness, half ready to be scolded. But instead of shouting, the foreman simply stared at the ground, then looked at the boy with an expression Keen could not decipher. It was not anger, not annoyance. It was something far rarer, astonishment shaped by respect. "How did you do this?" the foreman asked, his voice quieter than Keen had ever heard it. The boy swallowed, hesitant, unsure if the truth would sound foolish. He explained softly how he remembered the engineer's corrections, how he watched shadows on the beams during the day, how shapes made sense to him if he closed his eyes and imagined the structure lifting itself from the ground. His words were awkward, uncertain, but honest. The foreman listened without interrupting, each sentence tightening, the realization settling over him. This boy, this barefoot laborer carrying bricks for coins, was thinking like an architect. Keene expected disbelief, maybe mockery, but instead he saw something shift in the foreman's expression. A quiet recognition, a spark of understanding that this child possessed a rare instinctive mind that no classroom had touched. The foreman rose slowly, dusting his hands, but his gaze never left the drawing. He knew the yard was no place for a seed like this to wither. Throughout the day, his posture remained different when he watched Keene work. Not with suspicion, but with an unspoken responsibility gathering in his chest. The boy carried bricks with the same quiet discipline, but now the foreman saw more: the precision in his movements, the way he observed every column and angle, the silent hunger for knowledge burning in his eyes. That night, when the workers settled into tired sleep, the foreman sought Keene behind the storage shed where he often rested. He didn't call his name loudly. Instead, he approached with the gentleness of someone handling something fragile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of torn papers, edges frayed, ink faded, stolen from discarded notebooks used by site engineers. Along with them, he placed a short, half-used pencil in Keene's hand. "Keene," he whispered, "use these. Don't stop drawing. Not ever." As Keene held the papers, his breath shook, unaware that these simple tools would become the first doorway into a world he never imagined entering. And somewhere beyond the quiet night, fate waited for him to take his next step. His gift grew in the quietest corners of the night, shaping itself in shadows where no eye could judge it. Yet as dawn returned each morning, the same gift stirred whispers, envy, and unrest. Because brilliance, no matter how softly it breathes, refuses to remain unseen. And the more Keene tried to hide it, the louder destiny called his name. The nights became his true classroom, the darkness offering him both shelter and challenge. After the workers drifted into sleep and the construction yard fell into hushed stillness, Keene would slip into the back corner of the site, the torn papers held carefully between his fingers. The moon lit the ground in a pale glow, just enough for him to see the outline of his pencil strokes. He sketched with the intensity of someone trying to map the architecture of his own becoming. Angles that once confused him began to settle into place. Load distribution, which the engineer had shouted about in frustration, now unfolded in his mind with a sense of surprising clarity. Roof gradients, structural joints, tension points. Each night he pressed deeper into the mysteries of a world he was never meant to enter. The foreman often watched from a distance, leaning against a wooden beam with arms crossed, pretending he was only supervising the yard. But his eyes softened as he witnessed the evolution happening quietly before him. There was something sacred about the way Keene worked, focused, patient, reverent, as though each line he drew was a promise to himself. Sometimes the foreman stepped closer, offering quiet suggestions or small corrections he remembered from engineers over the years. Other times he simply nodded in approval, careful not to overwhelm the boy's delicate confidence. Keene treasured these moments more than he ever admitted. They were the first time someone believed in him, not because of what he carried on his back, but because of what he carried in his mind. Yet not everyone welcomed his growth. Older laborers, hardened by years of struggle and failures buried beneath bitterness, began noticing the scraps of paper in his hands and the faraway look in his eyes. At first they ignored it, assuming it was a passing hobby. But as the nights grew deeper and the drawings became more elaborate, their curiosity twisted into discomfort, and their discomfort sharpened into jealousy. They mocked him in subtle jabs, calling him professor, the barefoot engineer, brick boy, who wants to fly. Their laughter carried the sting of people who believed dreams were dangerous, especially for someone like him. And while Keene tried to brush off the words, their echoes clung to him, adding weight to every step he took. He felt the burn of their ridicule most during the day, when sweat dripped from his brow as he lifted bricks under the sun's unforgiving gaze. Their eyes followed him, searching for cracks in his determination, hoping to see him crumble under the pressure. But each night, as soon as he sat with his pencil again, those doubts dissolved. His hands found rhythm, his mind found meaning. Drawing was the only place where he did not feel too small for the world or too uneducated to belong. It was where he became exactly who he sensed he was meant to be. As weeks passed, his designs grew bolder, cleaner lines, refined spacing, more intricate layering. He studied the way light fell on structures at different times of day, how wind shifted around corners, how shadows deepened beneath overhangs. He noticed how buildings breathed, how they held people, protected them, shaped their lives. And in silent moments, he wondered what it would feel like to create something that lifted people up instead of weighing them down. One night, after hours of sketching, he paused to examine his latest drawing. It was a small school building with wide windows and reinforced beams, something simple, but filled with the quiet intention of giving children a safe space to learn, a space he himself had never been given. He traced one of the lines gently, imagining a world where his work could change the shape of someone's future. The thought sent a soft tremor through him, a strange mixture of hope and fear. The foreman approached silently, squatting beside the drawing with a thoughtful hum. "You're getting good, Keen," he murmured. "Better than good. Keep going." The boy nodded, trying to hide the smile growing on his face as the affirmation rooted itself deeply in his spirit. But outside the circle of his progress, the world continued to churn. Envy sharpened into resentment. Whispers expanded into conversations. Some men rolled their eyes every time he passed. Others shook their heads with annoyance, as though his dedication offended them. Still he did not stop. Determination, once fragile, had grown sturdy enough to hold him upright. Then one morning, the yard shifted with an unusual buzz. A sleek car rolled onto the site, its polished body reflecting the rising sun. A prestigious architect, known across the state for designing some of the region's most celebrated buildings, stepped out, accompanied by supervisors and engineers. Workers straightened, adjusting their clothes, eager to appear occupied. Khan kept his head down, lifting bricks with steady discipline, unaware that fate had arrived wearing polished shoes and carrying a critical eye. But destiny doesn't whisper. It chooses its moments loudly. The architect paused mid-step, his gaze landing on a discarded piece of Keen's paper lying near the mixing area. He bent down, curiosity guiding his fingers as he lifted it. His eyes widened the moment he recognized the precision in the sketch, clean, confident, impossibly advanced for a laborer's hand. And as he turned slowly toward Keen, the hum of the site fell into silence, signaling the beginning of a seismic shift in the boy's life. He arrived as a stranger with dusty boots, a curious gaze, and the quiet authority of a man who knew how buildings breathed. Yet what he found on that construction site was not cracked cement or crooked columns, but a child whose mind carved possibilities far beyond the bounds of poverty. And from the moment their eyes met, the air shifted with the weight of a future waiting to unfold. The architect stepped slowly across the construction yard, his steps measured, his gaze sweeping across the half-built structures with the instinct of someone who had spent decades reading materials, like sacred text. Workers paused briefly to acknowledge him, their postures stiffening in the presence of someone whose reputation carried whispers of brilliance and uncompromising standards. He greeted no one, absorbed entirely in the silent dialogue between lines, shadows, and rising pillars. Yet amid the hum of shovels and murmured instructions, his attention drifted toward something unexpected. A boy standing alone, staring at a crooked column with a level of focus that did not belong to any laborer, let alone a child. Kane did not notice the architect at first. His eyes were trained on the column's subtle lean, studying the way weight pressed unevenly against its base. He traced an invisible correction in the air with his fingers, unaware that his movements mirrored the gestures of someone who had been trained rather than someone who simply survived on instinct. The architect's brows lowered slightly, curiosity flickering in his expression as he watched the boy dissect the flaw with silent precision. Then, without warning, he approached. "What do you see there?" The architect's voice carried the calm firmness of a man accustomed to answers, not hesitation. Keen startled, stepping back slightly as the other workers stiffened nearby, watching. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he swallowed the tremor in his throat and responded honestly. He explained how the column had shifted during curing, how the weight of the beams above it would force a deeper lean over time, and how adjusting the reinforcement bars before the next layer dried would correct the flaw. He spoke softly, but with a clarity that carried surprising authority for a boy who had never stepped into a classroom. The architect stared at him, startled not by the correctness of the explanation, but by its calm depth. Few junior engineers could articulate structural errors with such natural understanding. He crouched beside the boy, following the direction of Keen's gaze, as if needing to confirm that the child truly saw what he claimed. When he stood again, his curiosity had sharpened into something more focused, more intentional. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Keen hesitated, unsure whether the truth would earn him trouble. Still, he answered simply, "By watching, and by drawing at night." The architect's expression changed at the word drawing. He asked to see the sketches, not as a command, but as a quiet challenge, a test wrapped in gentle insistence. The workers exchanged murmurs, some scoffing under their breath, others pausing in anticipation, as Keen slowly pulled out the folded sheets he kept tucked close to his chest. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed them over. The architect unfolded the papers one by one, his eyes moving from line to line with growing astonishment. The drawings held no childish hesitancy. They carried intention, precision, and an instinctive grasp of form and stability. He saw elevations, rudimentary floor plans, reinforced beam sketches, load paths, and corrections to structural flaws, concepts some university students struggled to understand. But here they were, shaped through the hands of a barefoot child, with no access to schooling, no access to materials, no access to the world that should have nurtured him. He felt something shift inside his chest, a mix of admiration and indignation. How many great minds had gone unnoticed simply because poverty wrapped itself around their potential like iron chains? How many gifted children carried brilliance their circumstances tried to bury? When he looked up, the boy stood silently, waiting for judgment the way poor children often did, expecting dismissal more than recognition. Instead, the architect asked quietly, "Who taught you?" And Keen answered with the truth that struck the man deeper than any blueprint ever had. "No one. I just see it." The architect exhaled slowly, the weight of that answer settling in his mind like a revelation. This was not talent. It was destiny in its rawest form. That evening, long after the site had quieted and workers dispersed, the architect followed Keen from a distance, observing the path the boy took home. He saw the worn sandals, the slow steps, the tired posture of a child carrying more than bricks. The sun dipped behind the horizon as Keen entered a small, crumbling settlement where homes leaned like tired shoulders pressed too long against hardship. Cliffhanger. When the architect saw where the boy lived and how little the world had offered him, his breath caught. In that moment, one truth became clear. Keen's future was far heavier than the bricks he carried, and changing it might demand more than admiration. It might demand intervention. There are homes so small that they cannot hold their own silence, yet inside them live stories so powerful they could break the strongest heart. And as the architect stepped toward Keen's fragile dwelling, he sensed that behind those trembling zinc walls lay a truth no blueprint could ever capture. The evening air was thick with the quiet weight of lived-in struggle, the kind that did not announce itself with tears or noise, but settled into the cracks of a home, like an old companion. The architect paused before entering, taking in the rusted sheets patched together with rope, the bent nails, catching what little light remained. Nothing about the structure was stable, yet it stood, refusing to collapse the same way the family inside refused to surrender to life, pressing against them. When he finally stepped through the narrow doorway, the scent of charcoal, damp earth, and worn fabric greeted him like an old, tired sigh. Keen's mother rose slowly from a low wooden stool, her feet bare, her wrapper faded from years of washing and sun. Yet her posture held a kind of dignity the world could not erode. She offered a gentle greeting, her voice soft but steady, like someone who had rehearsed calmness so many times it had become her only shield. The architect listened as she spoke, hesitant at first, then gradually revealing the truth layer by layer. She told him how Keen woke before dawn, worked odd jobs, carried heavy loads in the market, and still returned home to draw by lantern light. She explained that food came first, survival second, and school. School had been pushed to the farthest corner, visited only in dreams she no longer dared to entertain. Her words were not dramatic. They were simple, raw, and heavy, with the kind of resignation that came from fighting too many battles alone. The architect watched her hands tremble slightly as she folded a piece of cloth on her lap. She was not ashamed, only exhausted. Exhausted from giving, exhausted from hoping, exhausted from pretending that the future might someday widen for her son. His gaze shifted to the far corner of the small room, where Keen sat with his lantern, pencil, and a makeshift plank balanced across his knees. The boy's face glowed in the dim light, carved with determination sharper than his features should carry at his age. His hands moved with precision, sketching lines that formed structures beyond the imagination of someone living inside such scarcity. He did not look up when the architect entered. His focus was absolute. Even fatigue could not bend his concentration. Every stroke spoke of hunger, not the hunger of an empty stomach, but the hunger of a mind fighting to stay alive in a place where dreams often suffocated before they reached daylight. The architect watched in silence, moved in a way he had not expected. He had seen talent, he had mentored students, he had built towers, but he had never seen brilliance blooming inside hardship with such fierce defiance. He saw a boy building worlds on paper to escape the one that trapped him, and in that moment, the architect felt something shift inside him, an urgent conviction that this boy's journey could not be left to chance. Turning to Keen's mother, he spoke with a certainty that surprised even him. He promised to fund Keen's education completely, tuition, materials, every necessity. He described how the boy could attend a real school, one with resources, one where his gift would be recognized instead of ignored by circumstance. The woman's breath caught, her hand instinctively rising to her chest. Tears filled her eyes, not with weakness, but with the shock of a burden lifting after years of pressing unforgivingly against her spirit. For a brief moment, hope flickered inside the tiny home, warming even the coldest corners. The architect then approached Keen, eager to share the news directly. He expected joy, surprise, maybe disbelief. But as he knelt beside the boy, he sensed a quiet heaviness there, an emotional barricade that did not fit the moment. Keen's pencil stilled, his fingers tightening slightly around it. His eyes lifted slowly, not with excitement, but with a sorrowful clarity that made the architect pause mid-sentence. Something in those young eyes told him the boy carried a secret, one powerful enough to anchor him to this life, no matter what opportunities opened before him. And when Keen finally spoke, his voice steady yet shadowed with a truth too heavy for someone his age, the architect realized that the path he hoped to offer might already be chained by a responsibility far deeper than poverty itself, Some doors do not open into rooms. They open into battles. And when Keen stepped into his new classroom for the first time, it felt less like entering a school and more like walking into a silent arena where every eye waited to judge whether he even deserved to be there. The morning sun cast a soft glow across the school compound, but it did little to ease the tightness in Keen's chest as he walked past polished uniforms, laughter-filled groups, and students who carried their privilege with casual ease. His clothes, worn from years of careful mending, clung awkwardly to him, announcing his background before he ever spoke a word. The whispers began the moment he crossed the threshold. They were low, almost respectful in volume, but sharp enough to scrape against his confidence. Some glanced at his shoes, others at the frayed edges of his shirt, and a few exchanged knowing smiles that carried quiet judgment. Yet Keen kept walking, shoulders steady, heart firm, refusing to let the weight of their curiosity slow his steps. When the teacher began the day's lesson, the class settled into a practiced rhythm, pages turning, pens tapping, the subtle dance of students who had been raised with expectations whispering behind their every achievement. Keen sat in the second row, not by choice, but because he wanted to hear every word clearly. He had no room for mistakes, no luxury of falling behind. His mother's sacrifices, the architect's belief, and the fragile thread of hope that held his future together, all rode on the strength of his focus. So he leaned in, absorbing every detail, every explanation, every formula, like someone who feared knowledge might slip through his fingers if he dared to blink too long. The lesson shifted to mathematics, and the teacher wrote a complex equation across the board, one designed to challenge even the brightest students. A hush spread through the room. Many stared, confident, but cautious. A few smirked, knowing answers from past tutors. But Keen saw something else, an opportunity. His pencil moved almost instinctively, guided not by arrogance, but by the quiet discipline built from nights spent drawing precise lines by lantern glow. Numbers made sense to him the same way structures did. Every piece had a purpose, every angle a voice, every solution a hidden story waiting to be uncovered. When the teacher asked for volunteers to solve the problem, silence wrapped the room. Then Keen's hand rose, steady, unshaken. A ripple passed through the class, surprise, amusement, disbelief. But the teacher nodded, giving him space. Keen walked to the board, each step measured, and began to solve the equation. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, confident. As the final line fell into place, the teacher leaned forward, stunned by the accuracy and clarity of the solution. Some students stared with widened eyes, others with tightened jaws. A few exchanged glances heavy with jealousy, realizing that the outsider they had dismissed carried a depth they hadn't expected. But praise did not follow. The room was too young, too proud, too fragile to celebrate someone who had stepped into their world with nothing yet outperformed so many who had everything. The quiet mockery shifted into colder silence, a tension that wrapped itself around Keen's desk like a shadow refusing to fade. Yet he did nothing to push it away. He simply breathed, returned to his seat, and opened his notebook again. His purpose was not to impress them. It was to build a life waiting far beyond their judgment. The days that followed carried the same rhythm: whispers, pressure, surprise, resistance. Teachers began to notice him, not with favoritism, but with a growing respect that came from watching a mind sharpened by hunger for more than survival. Students watched him too, though their reactions differed. Some kept their distance, unwilling to admit admiration. Others tried harder, competing silently with the boy who had arrived from nowhere. And through it all, Keen pushed himself harder than anyone demanded. Each evening, he studied until his eyes burned, driven by a determination that grew each time someone doubted his place in that room. And then, on a quiet morning, when the air felt still enough to signal change, the announcement came. The school would participate in a national architecture competition, one known across the country for discovering extraordinary talent, one capable of altering the future of anyone who dared to compete. Students gasped, teachers exchanged excited glances, and the classroom erupted into a mix of chatter and ambition. Keen sat frozen for a moment, the words echoing through him like distant thunder. A competition, architecture, national level, recognition, opportunity. Everything he dreamed of, everything he feared, everything he hoped to escape and become, suddenly stood within reach. But as the excitement swirled around the room, Keen felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest, as though this opportunity carried a cost he hadn't yet understood. And before the day ended, a revelation would rise that threatened to shake his confidence in ways far beyond any classroom test. Some creations are not drawn with pencils alone. They are carved from memory, pain, and the longing to lift others from the shadows. And when Keen began his competition design, he knew he was not just building a structure. He was building a voice for all those the world had learned to overlook. The announcement of the National Architecture Competition had sent excitement flooding through the school. But for Keen, the moment felt heavier, quieter, almost sacred. While others dreamed of trophies, fame, or academic recognition, he carried a different vision, one shaped by nights spent studying under lantern glow and days spent watching his mother fight to keep their world from collapsing. He knew what it meant to live inside walls that were not strong enough, inside spaces that did not offer comfort or safety. And so, when he sat before his blank sheet of paper, he allowed those memories to guide his hand instead of fear. He envisioned a shelter, simple, affordable, yet powerful in purpose, crafted for families like his own, for children whose dreams were fragile and easily broken by the weight of poverty. He studied the textures of discarded materials, the angles that could resist harsh weather, the shapes that could trap warmth in cold nights and allow airflow in sweltering heat. Every decision he made was deliberate, born not from theory, but from lived experience. In each line, he wove compassion. In each curve, he placed understanding. In each detail, he whispered the quiet truth that dignity should never depend on wealth. As the design grew under his hands, the classroom slowly took notice. Students who had once mocked his worn clothes now watched him sketch with an intensity that unsettled them. There was no arrogance in his process, only calm determination, a deep and unwavering focus that made even the most confident competitors uneasy. Some pretended not to care. Others tried to work faster, their lines shaky with pressure. But Keen moved at his own pace, breathing life into a vision that came from a place none of them could understand. When the day of submission arrived, teachers walked between desks, collecting ideas that ranged from ambitious to extravagant. Yet the moment they reached Keen's desk, a strange hush settled over the space. His design did not scream for attention. It did not rely on grandeur or complexity. It simply spoke, softly, humbly, with the quiet power of a truth too often ignored. The judges, upon first glance, paused. They leaned closer. They traced the outline of his structure, noting the materials chosen, the practicality with which he approached cost, the beauty hidden in its simplicity. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to admiration, then to something deeper, respect. Word spread quickly. Students whispered in corners. Some stared openly as he walked past, their earlier judgments shrinking into silence. The boy they once overlooked had created something that forced them to confront their own privilege. His humility made their pride feel small. His clarity made their doubts feel foolish, and though no one said it aloud, the atmosphere around him changed. For the first time since entering the school, he no longer felt invisible. Yet despite the growing attention, Keen's emotions churned beneath the surface. Fear and hope battled inside him. Fear of failing when so much had been poured into his support. hope that this might be the doorway into the life he had dreamed of quietly for years. Each night leading up to the results, he lay awake, replaying every line of his design, wondering if he had done enough, if he had honored his mother's sacrifices, if he had met the trust the architect placed in him. His mother, sensing the weight he carried, did not offer grand speeches or soothing promises. Instead, she prayed silently, her hands resting gently over her heart, asking for nothing more than strength and clarity for her son. The morning of the competition results dawned with an uneasy stillness. Students gathered, hearts pounding, faces alive with expectation. Teachers lined the room, waiting for the judge's final words. Kane stood near the back, his breath slow and measured, trying to steady the storm within. When the head judge stepped forward with the envelope, a ripple of anticipation surged through the hall. But when the list of winners was finally revealed, something unexpected happened, something far greater than any trophy, something that made the entire room turn toward Keane. As fate opened a door, none of them had imagined for him. Some victories arrive so quietly that only the heart hears them, yet their weight lifts years of struggle in a single breath. And when Keane's name was announced as the competition winner, it felt as though the world had finally exhaled the burden he had carried since childhood. The hall erupted in applause the moment the judges revealed the results, but for Keane, the sound seemed distant, softened by disbelief. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, unable to process the truth that the design born from his own memories had risen above entries crafted with far greater privilege and resources. Students stared at him with a mixture of awe and quiet regret, their earlier doubts dissolving into a respect they could no longer hide. Teachers exchanged approving nods, their pride visible in their softened expressions. Yet the loudest reaction came from within Keane himself, a trembling relief that threatened to buckle his knees. When the judges stepped forward and presented him the prestigious scholarship to study architecture at one of the nation's finest universities, his entire life seemed to shift, as though destiny had finally caught up with the determination he had carried for so long. His mother cried quietly that evening, her tears falling not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of a burden she had worn like a second skin. The architect visited their home again, this time with a smile that reached his eyes, reassuring them that this scholarship was only the beginning. Keane packed his few belongings carefully, each item holding a piece of his old world, and left for the university with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and a longing that tugged softly at his chest. The university campus was a different world entirely, vast, polished, buzzing with ambition and brilliance. Buildings stretched skyward with grace, students hurried between classes with confident steps, and conversations floated through the air filled with theories, innovations, and dreams spoken openly. Keane, in his modest clothes and quiet nature, felt briefly like an outsider once again. Yet he refused to shrink beneath the weight of comparison. He had not come to blend in, he had come to learn, to grow, to honor every sacrifice that had carried him this far. Classes began with an intensity that startled even the most prepared students. Professors introduced theories that bent the imagination, mathematics that felt like labyrinths, and design principles that demanded precision beyond intuition. Many struggled, some complained. But Keane approached each lesson with the same resilience that had guided him since childhood. Every concept he learned unfolded into a vision of what he could someday build. Every late-night study session reminded him of lantern-lit sketches in his tiny home, where dreams were shaped by necessity rather than luxury. When classmates grew frustrated, he steadied himself with memories of dusty yards, rusted zinc walls, and the quiet prayers of his mother whispered into the night. Slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Professors took notice of him, not because he was the loudest voice in the room, but because his understanding ran deep. When he spoke, he did so with clarity shaped by experience rather than theory. His designs carried an unusual combination of technical precision and emotional resonance. He saw structures not only as shapes and materials, but as lifelines for those who needed them most. And the academic world, which often celebrated ambition over empathy, found itself drawn to the humility and sharpness he carried so naturally. As the semesters passed, Ken transformed, not in appearance, not in arrogance, but in capability. He became someone his peers sought guidance from, someone professors referenced as an example of rare insight, someone who could no longer remain invisible, even if he wanted to. His journey was not without challenges. There were moments of exhaustion, nights when fear crept in quietly, and days when the weight of expectations felt almost too heavy. But he moved forward with steady courage, each step a quiet triumph over the life he had left behind. And then, one night, just as the semester reached its busiest point, the past returned in a way he had not expected. He was studying late in the common room, diagrams spread before him, when a sudden murmur rippled through the space. Students gathered around the television, their faces marked by concern. The broadcast spoke urgently, showing images of rural communities facing an unexpected crisis. And then, in the middle of the report, he recognized it. The familiar path, the cluster of fragile homes, the worn landscape of his childhood village. As the reporter's voice revealed the unfolding tragedy, Keane felt the ground shift beneath him, realizing that the life he had fought so hard to build might now demand a return to the world he thought he had finally escaped. Some moments tear through a man's life so suddenly that even success cannot shield him. And when the storm struck Keane's village, it did not call for the celebrated architecture student he was becoming, but for the frightened boy he once was, the one who knew all too well what broken homes meant for fragile lives. The night had begun like any other on campus. Quiet lamps glowing across the courtyard, students hunched over textbooks, the soft murmur of focused ambition echoing in the halls. Ken was in the design studio, pencil moving with quiet precision across a sheet of drafting paper, when the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere caught his attention. A cluster of students had gathered around the television mounted on the far wall, their expressions grave. He walked over slowly, a faint unease softening his steps. And then he saw it. The images splashed across the screen, the frantic reporter speaking over the roar of wind, the devastation carved into the earth, and the unmistakable view of the narrow path that led to his childhood home. The storm had not been kind. Roofs had been ripped away, like scraps of paper, walls reduced to scattered stones, and the familiar cluster of fragile structures he had grown up among now stood bent, broken. It felt as though, and pulled at threads memories he had stitched, nights of watching his changed so quickly. His mother stood near the remains of their old neighbor's house, her hands trembling though her face remained steady. The moment she saw him, her composure cracked just slightly, relief softening her shoulders. He held her gently, not wanting to add to her fears, yet unable to hide the heaviness pressing against his heart. There was no time for long embraces, no space for grief to settle. The village needed hands, minds, direction, something the storm could not shatter. Keane stepped into the center of the chaos, his calm presence creating a small pocket of order. Villagers gathered instinctively around him, remembering the boy who had once sketched houses on patches of sand, who had always spoken of building safer homes someday. He grabbed an old piece of cardboard and borrowed charcoal from a roadside vendor. Kneeling on the ground, he sketched rapidly, translating fear into solutions. He designed temporary shelters that could withstand wind, using materials still available around them: bamboo, leftover metal sheets, woven mats. He explained how to anchor them, how to angle the roofs, how to arrange sleeping areas to keep families warm and safe. His voice, though soft, carried a confidence that soothed panic and steadied trembling hands. Hours passed with no thought of rest. Kane moved from one collapsed home to another, guiding villagers through the reconstruction process. He lifted beams with care, assessed structural weaknesses, reassured children who clung to their mothers. His clothes grew muddy, His hands blistered, but he worked as though the storm had not struck the village but his own spirit, repairing others in order to repair himself. Each shelter they rebuilt brought a quiet, almost sacred satisfaction, a reminder that his education was never meant to elevate him alone, but to lift those who had shaped the earliest parts of his journey. Yet even as temporary solutions took shape, a deeper concern tugged at him. The destruction was not uniform. Certain areas were far more devastated than others. The soil had shifted strangely, drainage paths had collapsed, and some homes seemed weakened long before the storm arrived. As he walked the outskirts of the village at dusk, the fading light revealed fractures in the earth, long uneven splits that whispered of a threat far greater than wind or rain. And as Keene traced the broken ground with a sinking heart, he realized that what the storm had exposed was not just structural weakness, but a danger woven silently beneath the land itself, one that could destroy the village long before the next storm ever arrived. Some revolutions do not begin in grand halls or with thunderous speeches. They rise quietly from broken soil, from wounds left by storms, from the hands of one young man kneeling beside ruins, turning despair into a blueprint that would soon challenge an entire nation's way of building. In the days that followed the storm, Keene's mind refused to rest. The fractures he had seen beneath the village earth replayed themselves in his thoughts like a silent warning. The land was changing, the weather was becoming unpredictable, and the homes of the poor were no longer strong enough to endure these shifts. What began as emergency repairs soon demanded something larger, deeper, and far more enduring. With a notebook tucked under his arm and memories of his own childhood home flickering behind every idea, he began designing structures that could resist not only wind, but rising water, shifting soil, and the merciless seasons that had long tormented vulnerable communities. He walked the village from corner to corner, gathering wisdom from elders, observing how traditional homes were built, and studying the behavior of the land after heavy rains. Instead of importing expensive concepts, he explored what the people already had: bamboo, clay, compressed earth blocks, recycled zinc, woven palm fibers. Each material held its own story, its own resilience, its own relationship with the environment. Keene blended them carefully, designing homes that could breathe, bend, and absorb pressure without breaking. His sketches grew into detailed plans, and soon the first prototypes rose from the ground, simple yet sturdy, humbly beautiful, and unmistakably protective. The transformation was immediate. Families who had once feared the approach of storm clouds now stood confidently inside walls that held firm. Elders marveled at how the homes resisted flooding by redirecting rainwater through cleverly structured channels. Children slept more peacefully, mothers cooked without the constant dread of collapsing roofs, and the village seemed to stand a little taller each morning. Word of the young architect's designs traveled quickly, carried by traders, visitors, and the quiet astonishment of neighboring communities. Soon, curious groups arrived, eager to see what this boy from the village had created. Requests began to pour in. Villages far beyond his region sent messages asking for guidance. Community leaders traveled miles to observe his structures firsthand. What had started as local repair work now stood at the edge of a movement. His professors contacted him, expressing pride and offering technical support. NGOs visited with interest, recognizing the potential of his model to address long-standing housing crises. They listened to him speak, not with arrogance, but with grounded clarity, about the dignity that strong homes gave to forgotten families, and the responsibility architects held to those who lived beyond the edges of major cities. With the help of volunteers, donors, and the growing trust of communities, Keene established a small organization. It was not built from polished offices or expensive equipment, but from purpose. The mission was simple: empower impoverished builders and families with the knowledge, tools, and training to create homes that could protect them for generations. Workshops sprouted across the region. Local youth learned framing techniques. Mothers learned how to reinforce walls with natural fibers. Men who had spent their lives doing manual labor began to see themselves as builders of the future, not just survivors of the past. The organization grew faster than Kane expected. His architectural philosophy spread like dawn, breaking over distant hills. Newspapers published stories about the young man transforming rural housing. Universities invited him to speak, struck by the fusion of engineering precision and emotional insight in his work. Radio programs discussed his designs. People spoke of him not as a prodigy, but as a builder of hope, a rare voice insisting that progress did not have to leave the poor behind. Yet despite the growing admiration, Kane remained anchored in humility. He returned to his village often, checking on the houses he had designed, listening to feedback, refining his ideas. Each structure represented more than architecture. It carried the weight of his past, the prayers of his mother, and the quiet promise he had made to himself on the night he saw his village on television. He believed deeply that change must rise from the ground upward, and so he continued shaping, teaching, learning. But with influence came a tension of a different kind. Not everyone welcomed his ideas. Contractors who profited from cheap, unsafe construction felt threatened. Politicians disliked the way his work reminded the public of their neglected responsibilities. Business owners who sold overpriced building materials saw his affordable designs as a danger to their earnings. Whispers surfaced, soft at first, then sharper, as powerful forces moved behind the scenes, troubled by the shift he represented. And as Keane prepared to take his movement to an even wider audience, he sensed the shadow of resistance tightening around him, an unseen opposition rising quietly, waiting for the moment to strike at everything he had worked so hard to build. Some battles are fought with fists and noise, but the greatest ones are fought in silence, weaponed with truth, clarity, and a purpose too deeply rooted to be shaken. And when the powerful rose against Keane, they did not face a student or a village boy, but a man carrying every brick, every wound, and every dream that had shaped him. Keane's work had spread across regions with a speed none had expected. Families who once slept under leaking roofs now lived in homes shaped with dignity. Communities that had known only loss during storms began standing stronger each season. Yet this progress, instead of being celebrated universally, stirred discomfort among those who had long profited from the desperation of the poor. Contractors who built cheap structures at high prices watched their influence crumble. Officials who diverted funds meant for community housing lost a silent source of power. And business owners who thrived on inflated material costs found his affordable designs threatening. The more Keane's work grew, the more their shadows lengthened. It began with subtle obstructions, permits delayed, inspections scheduled unfairly, materials blocked from entering certain regions. Then came rumors whispered into government ears, painting him not as a visionary, but as a disruptive force challenging tradition. Some officials sent letters demanding he halt construction until further evaluation. Others threatened to revoke the partnerships he had earned through months of honest work. His volunteers grew nervous. Communities feared the return of neglect. And in the middle of this turmoil, Keane felt a familiar heaviness press against him. The same weight he had carried as a child in a broken home. The same fear of losing progress just when hope had begun to bloom. But instead of shrinking beneath the pressure, he anchored himself in the very principles that had carried him this far. He refused to allow fear to guide his steps. He gathered every document, every design, every model built with community participation, and prepared to do what few dared. Confront the government directly, armed only with truth and the undeniable results of his work. The invitation to present before national leaders came unexpectedly, almost reluctantly, after public demand grew for clarity on why his projects were being obstructed. It was a chance few received, and a platform many feared. Yet Kane walked into that hall with the same steady determination he had carried, since the days of studying under lantern glow. National leaders filled the room: ministers, engineers, policymakers, critics. Some expected him to falter, others waited to dismiss him. But when Keane began to speak, his voice held an unwavering calm. He did not appeal for sympathy or praise. Instead, he spoke of storms he had lived through, homes that had collapsed around families like his, children who slept in fear during rainy seasons, and mothers who patched walls with trembling hands. He presented not arguments, but evidence: photos of rebuilt communities, statistics showing reduced flood damage, testimonials from elders whose lives had changed. His designs were not theoretical dreams. They were living structures that had survived real storms. His philosophy was rooted not in academic grandeur, but in lived necessity. Silence settled over the hall as he projected maps showing areas still vulnerable, millions still living in unsafe structures, entire regions waiting for solutions that politics had long ignored. And then, with quiet resolve, he presented his national model: affordable, sustainable housing built from local materials, empowering local labor, strong enough to withstand shifting climates. It was not just architecture. It was a path to dignity. The leaders exchanged slow nods. Experts leaned forward. For the first time, critics found no flaw to grasp. By the end of the session, the room rose in recognition, not because he demanded it, but because truth had lifted itself above the noise. Government support followed swiftly. Budgets were reallocated. Corrupt officials exposed their own intentions by resisting new policies and were removed. Keane's once-threatened mission transformed into national policy, reaching corners of the country where neglect had become an inherited condition. Communities rose across the nation, earth-colored homes shaped with the resilience of his designs. Children played in courtyards, safe from flooding. Elderly couples rested beneath roofs that did not tremble with every gust of wind. Builders who once felt powerless now trained others, carrying his vision like a torch passed from hand to hand. Hope was no longer a distant dream. It had become a foundation laid with purpose. Keane, though celebrated, remained grounded. He continued traveling from one region to another, ensuring his philosophy remained connected to the soil it came from. And then, one quiet morning on a construction site, he noticed a small child lifting a brick almost too heavy for his tiny hands. The boy carried it with care, his steps slow but determined, mirroring the resolve Keane once carried at his age. When the child reached him and whispered a few soft words, Keane felt his breath catch, because in that innocent voice lay the reminder of why his journey had begun, and a revelation that would guide the next chapter of his mission. If Keane's journey stirred something within you, then stay with us, because stories like his are still rising from the quiet corners of Africa. Your single like, comment, or share helps these voices travel further, reaching those who need hope the most. Subscribe to this channel and walk with us into the next untold tale waiting to unfold. Your support isn't just engagement. It is the spark that keeps these stories alive.